Alright, so I would like to start out by apologizing about how loud the intro in the first episode was, but welcome to West is Best, Episode 2. Today we're going to be talking about the slave trade, as the name implies, and how the British fought to end it. We oftentimes hear about how the Europeans started the slave trade and how terrible it was, and it was terrible, and we can all agree on that, but what's not often discussed is how the British were the ones who fought tooth and nail to end it. And that, it started out in 1807 when the British started fighting against it. The slave trade had been going on since the 1500s. But it started out in 1807 with the abolition of the Slave Trade Act. And it looked to abolish the slave trade in the British Empire and pressure Britain to force other nations to end their slave trade and do the same as the British were. William Wilberforce was the main sort of leader of the British anti-slave movement, and he is a hero, and he's poorly remembered, and I'd like to, bring him up because he was an absolute amazing person. He was the main person behind ending the slave trade in the entire world, and the slave abolition won in Parliament with 283 votes to supporting the ending of the slave trade, compared to only 16 votes against it in 1807. And that's a lot. The British clearly, if Britain was a horrible racist nation that really wanted slavery, it would not be such a staggering victory. That was an insane victory. Only 16 people voted against it compared to 283 votes for it. That's pretty crazy. The British then went to other countries and tried to get them to do the same as they had hoped to do in the beginning. And it worked pretty well. The U.S. ended their slave trade with Africa the same month. Now slavery continued in America, and their internal slave trade continued, but they did end their importing of slaves from Africa. The British got Portugal to restrict its slave trade in 1810. It got Sweden to outlaw their slave trade in 1813. It got France to hate it and really look down upon it, and to end it by agreed to abolish it in 1814. They got the Dutch to outlaw it in 1814. They got the Spanish to suppress it in 1817. In 1808, the British Royal Navy established the West Africa Slave Patrol. And it started out with 2 ships, and it cost them a lot of money. Now, by its height, when the British really started getting into the abolition of the slave trade, 1/6 of the Royal Navy was fighting in the West Africa Squadron to end the slave trade. Now, this isn't the modern British Navy. This was the British Navy at its height, when they were the largest, most powerful navy in the world. And 1/6 of that went to ending slavery. That is an insane amount of money and troops to send to Africa to do something that really didn't benefit them in any economic or political manner. It was the right thing to do, so they did it, and they gave a lot for it. It started with only 2 ships, but it got really massive, and then it started to go down as slavery declined. And from 1808 to 1860, it stopped over 1,600 slave ships, 1,600 slave ships, and freed 150,000 slaves. That is an amazing amount of people they freed and saved. Not to mention the ships that they did stop and destroyed or captured, or the ships that they took out of the slave trade. Who knows how many, and slavers they arrested, who knows how many more slaves or Africans they had saved from becoming slaves in the first place. And they really ended the slave trade by doing this, and they forced, during the Napoleonic Wars, they forced Portugal, really their only mainland ally at the time, because everyone else was pretty much controlled by Napoleon, or at least competent ally. They forced Portugal to keep slaves in Africa and only be able to trade in Africa. They forced the Portuguese to let British ships to police Portuguese ships carrying people from Africa to anywhere else in the world, and they really weren't in a great position to do that. Portugal was one of their few allies, and Portugal really liked their slave trade, but the British still said, no, you need to allow us to police your ships and make sure you aren't sending slaves anywhere else. They did let them transport slaves in Africa, but they really fought to end it, and they fought hard. The British protected slaves in Sierra Leone. Most of those 150,000 slaves, when they were freed, they went to the first British West African colony of Sierra Leone because they were afraid that if they went anywhere else, they would wind up slaves again, which they probably would. And the British were able to protect them successfully in Sierra Leone. And they completely took their lives from wherever they were before, and they moved them to Sierra Leone where the British could protect them easily. Britain was pretty much a bully at this time when it came to the other nations in the slave trade, and they used like diplomatic and military and economic force to force these nations to let the Royal Navy police their ships and make sure they weren't hauling slaves, and if they were, to free those slaves. It was not very, the other Europeans didn't really like it, because when you have this big trade that's gotten you a lot of money and someone else comes along who's bigger and stronger than you and forces you to give it up, you're not exactly going to like it. But the British still did it, even though it didn't make them any friends and it cost them a ton of money. They did it because it was the right thing to do. From 1830 to 1865, 1,587 British troops lost their lives in the slave patrol. That's a lot of people, especially since they weren't getting any major return out of this aside from just doing the right thing. And I will say in a lot of my videos that when it comes to like white guilt and colonial guilt and stuff like that, and slave guilt, you shouldn't feel guilty because you didn't do that. And even if you are related to someone who did sometime in the past, you had nothing to do with that, and you don't have any control over that, so why should you feel guilty? But with the slave trade, up until 2014, British taxes still were paying off the debt created by the West African Slave Patrol. And so, if you were a British taxpayer from, 1808 to 2014, you had some major true contribution directly to ending the slave trade. And that's something that you should take pride in, and it's something that the British did great, and that is rarely talked about because it doesn't fit the narrative that, white people are bad, and I don't know what idea they give for how the slave trade ended aside from the British ended it, because it's not like the slaves got up and fought themselves. And another thing that's another common misconception about slavery is that the Europeans went into Africa, kidnapped Africans, and then brought them to America or their other colonies to be slaves. That is not what happened at all. The Europeans went down to Africa, and they found great, strong African kingdoms, and they said, if you trade us your prisoners of war and any, prisoners of war or slaves, we will give you guns and modern technology and manufactured goods. And the Africans jumped all over it, and they went out and started conquering more and more, enslaving more and more, and selling them to the Europeans. So that's what happened. It wasn't Europeans enslaving Africans. Well, going in and taking Africans as slaves. They were buying slaves from Africans, as slave trades in Africa were very big and thriving well before the Europeans arrived in Africa. And during this time, just after the British really started, after the slave patrol started to go into decline, because there was hardly any need for it, because most of slavery had been eradicated, after the Civil War and the U.S. abolishing slavery, that was one of the better times for slavery in human history. I mean, today, you might think, well, slavery is only small and illegal. While it is illegal in every country, as far as I know, slavery is very likely at its worst in human history. There are up to 40 million people living in slavery today. That's almost 4 times the amount of people who died. That's over 4 times the amount of people who died in the Holocaust. That is an immense amount of people, a quarter of which are children. And there's no one out there really, fighting to end the slave trade like the British did. The British really pursued this with vigor and passion, and they really wanted to end this because it was horrible, and it was a crime against humanity. It was injustice, and they really wanted to stop it. Nowadays, there isn't really much of any cry against slavery because it's not viewed as a major problem, but it is still today a far greater problem. And the British Empire was able to look at that problem, address it, and actually take action against it. They didn't just sit back and say, oh, it's hardly a problem, someone else will take care of that. No, they decided that because Europe was so superior economically and militarily, that it was their duty as Europeans and British to go in and stop this horrible thing, this horrible plague on humanity. And they did. Unlike modern day, where if you did say, you know, as America or Britain is superior to Nigeria or Libya, it is our duty to go in and stop the horrible slave trade. Or China, where is one of the, if not the top slave-owning country, because, I mean, really, the government, everyone is a slave in China to the government, but they have insane amounts of slavery across Africa, especially in Libya, and Middle East, and India, and China. Same thing with North Korea, similar to China. Everyone is a slave for the government. We all know how terrible North Korea is. But countries today, if you said that, you know, we as Europeans, as Americans, we are so superior to these countries, and they are in a horrible place doing a horrible thing, and it is our duty to end it, people would look down on you and say, no, it's, you know, we're not that superior, and it's not that big of a problem. I don't know why why it's not known how big of a problem modern slavery is, but for some reason it isn't, and people will not address it and will not take action against it, especially if you base that action on the fact that we are superior as Westerners to the people who are enslaving each other. And they won't decide that it is our duty as superior Westerners to end this horrible practice. Sorry for ranting there at the end. I'm going to do 2 videos today, so look out for the second one. And I hope you enjoyed. Have a good morning, good evening, or good night, depending on whenever you watch this. I will see you in the next video.